Hi everybody, welcome to today's ISE webinar. Really excited to be doing this in partnership with Amberjack today. My name is Steve Ishwood, Chief Exec of the ISE, and I'll be emceeing today's webinar. If you haven't been on one of our webinars before, it's possible, so please use the Q&A, please use the chat. If you pop questions and any thoughts into there, I will then act as moderator and feed those back through to our presenters. We're aiming to get this done in an hour. Ask questions as we go along, as in we will, but we've also got time at the end where we can cover off questions. So like I said, please pop them in there and I'll keep an eye on those. So today's webinar, great detailed insights that we're getting from Amberjack. You're going to be talking about their latest data from the 22 report. So we're going to be talking about recruitment trends, attraction, D&I, and also assessments and the candidate experience, a whole bunch of things to get through. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Emily, and Emily will take it from here. Emily, over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks Stephen for the intro. So thank you very much for joining today. Lots to crack through, so we'll get going. And just to let you know that it'll be myself, Cassie Sissons, Managing Director, and Martin Kavanagh, our very new Head of Assessment, who will be guiding you through the data today. So just as a quick intro, for those of you who haven't accessed our reports previously, we release our insights reports every year and have been doing so for the past well over 10 years now. And the purpose of the reports is to give some real insight into the employer trends, but also to look at candidate behaviours as well. So the analysis and data that you see today is made up from two key parts: an employer survey that we sent out and received 95 responses back, and over 300,000 candidate applications. So really robust data that we've been able to pull down some great themes from. And this year we've got a great sector mix as well, so we've been able to dive a little bit deeper into some key sectors as well, and more on that as we go through. And just to reiterate that this data is very much hot off the press, so it's from the current recruitment season. So everything you're seeing today is very much up to date. We've spent the last couple of weeks analysing all of this, and there will be more to follow after the session today, which we'll come on to later. But today is very much about sharing those initial themes, trends and analysis that we found from all of the data. Just one more point before we sort of move through is that the majority of the data that we'll show today is a combination of both graduate and apprentice data combined. And that is because we have found that from an employer perspective, those trends have been quite similar. But where there are differences, we have pulled those out and we'll highlight those to you. But as we work through the session, if there are any particular data points or anything that you feel you would like to delve into in more detail, we've probably got the data that sits behind that. So make a note and please, we'll share our contact details at the end and you can get in contact with us. So just moving on to give you a bit of a flavour of the sectors in terms of organisations that participated. As I said, this year we received 95 submissions, which was great, and a really good spread across those different sectors. So hopefully, you know, if you do want some more detailed info on your particular sector, we can get that for you. So the first section of our employer survey looked at recruitment post-pandemic. So obviously the last couple of years have thrown up many challenges, but certainly the past 6 months we've seen a return back to some sort of normality. And the reason we asked these questions is we wanted to understand what the new season would look like for our clients, but also the broader sector, so we can make sure that we're focusing our attention, resources, etc. in the right place, but also that we're giving our clients the right information and support. So the first question we asked was, what practices and processes did you implement through the pandemic? And no massive surprises there. Many of you know, the employers joining today will have switched to a fully virtual process virtually overnight. And we see here that the biggest switch was obviously to that virtual assessment centre, but also the virtual on-campus piece as well. And as restrictions have been lifted, and I appreciate that we've gone in and out of those restrictions, but certainly since the beginning of the year, we have seen that return to no restrictions whatsoever. And have those, as those have been lifted, have these remained? And there's definitely been a shift. So even though we are now back to a relatively steady pace of life and also normality, there's definitely been a shift in the ways in which recruiters are going onto campus and managing their processes. And the next question just delved into a little bit around which of those has actually remained. And as you'll see here, the biggest ones are around the virtual campus activity, and that's no massive surprise due to the fact that if we sort of think back to last September, we were still very much in the throes of in and out of new variants. So employers were much more hesitant to go back onto campus. And also the virtual assessment centres have stayed, and that has been, we've seen many benefits of those virtual assessment centres around, accessibility, diversity, just resource and budget costs. So it's definitely something that looks to remain as we go into new season. And the final question we asked was around, do you intend to return back to in-person recruitment activity? And you can see that, around 25% said yes, so there'll be lots that are going back, but the vast majority have talked about a hybrid approach, so a real balance of virtual and face-to-face interaction. So what does that mean for employers thinking about the new season? So that hybrid approach is very much likely to continue. So employers need to think about sort of considering the balance and implications of being back onto campus, what your competitors are doing, and thinking about what that means for your brand and your interactions with students. It looks like there's going to be a continuation of digital and virtual assessment centres. And throughout the past 2 years, there's definitely been an uplift in terms of candidate expectations, the technology they're using, how that's managed. So employers need to keep an eye on what that technology is and how they continue to invest in it. And there's definitely been some initiatives that we've seen an uplift in, things like coaching calls and tech checks. That's really helped improve the candidate experience for those students going through the processes. And as we move back into more face-to-face activity, it will be good to sort of see how those continue. But also, if employers are able to do them, it's a real key differentiator in terms of that candidate experience. So recruitment challenges, we ask year on year about recruitment challenges, and you'll see here there's been quite a shift from the previous year. So if we look back one season, you'll see that the top challenge for employers was recruitment technology. And again, no surprise, as everybody had to switch all of their processes, use new technology, understand the technology, understand the implications of using that technology. So, and budget is in there at number 2. Again, no surprise, due to the fact that the world was very uncertain, economy was very uncertain, and therefore, I guess the implication for employers was that there was a hesitancy in terms of spending and looking at what sort of changes and new processes could be implemented. There's some ones that stay steady, so candidate quality is in there each year as well. But the big shift we've seen this year is that diversity and inclusion has come in at number 1, so a real sort of laser focus back onto that, and also attraction. And this is probably due to the fact that we have moved into very much a candidate-led market. So the increase in vacancies has meant that employers have had to work much harder on campus, not only to attract, but also to keep those candidates in the process and then keep them warm as they come into the onboarding process. So that's an overview of the challenges. What we're going to do now is go into a couple of those challenges in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to hand over to Cassie now, who's going to focus on attraction.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, so as Emily outlined, we've got some significant challenges that employers are focusing on, one of which is attraction. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the data that we've seen coming out of attraction, some reflections of what that might mean and what that's telling us. And then we'll move on to D&I, which also kind of stood out as one of the key recruitment challenges that employers are currently focused on. I think what we definitely all have experienced in the last season that some of us are still in actually is a real bounce back market from a candidate perspective. I think, you know, last year there were significant levels of applications coming from candidates with little less choice than usual and what they've seen in previous seasons. And this year, much more confidence in the market, many more opportunities than there were the previous year. And as a result, we've seen organisations having to really focus on their attraction strategy and what they're doing with their budget and where they're spending, where they're actually spending that budget. And as a result, what we've seen is some interesting shifts in the budgets that have actually been allocated to attraction this season versus 2021. We've seen some increases, particularly if we look at the 100k to 200k budget allocation bracket here. People not really spending very much in that space at all, and a significant leap where organisations are having to potentially rethink their attraction strategy during the course of the recruitment cycle to top up, do more activity in areas they might not have had to work so hard on it before. There's a significant increase in competition in the graduate early careers market at the moment, not just grads but also within apprentices, and we're seeing in the work that we're doing a kind of more phased approach to how those budgets are working. Definitely not spending all your attraction budget in one go, because there is potentially the likelihood that either through numbers not converting, reneges particularly screaming out as a big issue, that you might have to go back and do some more work and think really carefully about where you're placing those budgets and where you're getting your best return on investment. Building on that, looking at application levels, I think, you know, actually what none of us really want to see, for a number of reasons, are significant applications per hire. That's, you know, not a great candidate experience. You're increasing the chances of not getting a job, and actually there's an increased cost to that, having to manage more applications through a recruitment process. So what everybody is really focused on is attracting the right candidates into your process through the right kind of messaging, ensuring that candidates understand what it is they're applying to and could they see themselves there, and then keeping them engaged in that process. And then through your assessment tools, ensuring the right ones stay in that process. That's kind of on paper perfectly what we're all trying to achieve. But actually what we've seen in this cycle is definitely a downturn in the number of applications per hire. So from graduates, we're seeing 59-1 applications as compared to previous season of 71-1, and we're seeing that same pattern emerging in apprenticeships, 33-1 versus 57-1 generally last year. There are areas where we are still seeing significant applications in comparison to the hire ratio, particularly in technology and telecommunications for graduate recruitment, and then again in technology for apprenticeship recruitment, and quite a high application to hire ratio in retail as well. So yes, I think it's not a bad thing, essentially would be our take from this data. It's great to have less applications, so long as you're then keeping those ones in that are ultimately hopefully going to be a good hire for you. And that's a different kind of issue in itself in terms of candidate engagement and managing reneges and withdrawals. Looking then at application trends from the data set, nothing too surprising at first glance on this. As expected, in line with recruitment cycles for early careers, we're seeing the majority of applications coming through from sort of, you know, September through to early November. That is in line with when the majority of organisations begin to open for applications to encourage candidates to apply to their programmes. Got later cycles for apprenticeships in some cases, and some organisations are always on recruiting all year round. So that's kind of where we see our spikes pre-Christmas, and then another spike where we've seen organisations having to go back out to market to recruit more people due to either lack of applications or reneges, and also a spike when some of the apprenticeship programmes are opening. So the insight really to take from this is nothing that surprising, but I guess it's important to note that the majority of applicants that do get hired are those that are applying in the early stages during September through to early November. So really important, if you can, to ensure that you're out at that point in time, to ensure that you are reaching candidates that are actively looking for opportunities, and you're kind of not losing a competitive advantage by not being open until later. Another kind of key insight from this data set is the difference between male applications and female application peak dates. Quite surprisingly, we thought when we first looked at this actually that male application dates peak in August, whereas female applications follow the market and are peaking in October. In our experience, the organisations we work with and the sector that we're in, most organisations truly aren't opening in earnest until autumn. So with the exception of some of the consultancy, law and banking firms that are open a bit kind of earlier in the summer, that doesn't mean those organisations aren't attracting females. It's just that the males are quite quick to get their applications in. So if you're particularly focused on gender diversity, perhaps it might be worth doing some specific attraction to female target groups during the late summer period to encourage them to apply at the same time as their male counterparts, to ensure that you are, you know, attracting and converting those applications in at the same time as where we're seeing that spike from the chaps. Then looking at sources of data, sources of application and hire for the graduate market, first of all. So we've got a kind of broad range of different sources here that candidates are citing as their main source when applying for the roles that are available to them. One of the things that we always have to take into account is that we are relying on the graduate giving us the right source. So when they're applying and going through that process, where did you hear about us? That we've got to rely on what they're putting forward is the right thing. Clearly it is going to vary, and we all know that it's sometimes a number of things that attract a candidate to. They could be looking at you on your website. They could also be speaking to somebody on campus that has done an internship with you. They could be applying or seeing you on a job board. So overall, there are a number of different things that do push candidate attraction and engagement. But these are the key sources in terms of application numbers across everybody that we were able to analyse, and then what then resulted in actual hires. So one of the key things here to call out is that company websites and Google searching are sit at the top in terms of numbers of applications, and quite a strong then conversion for both, particularly on the company website, into those that actually then end up being hired by organisations. So truly, these are your kind of most important, if you like, sources of candidates. So ensuring that the content that you've got out there and the search engine optimization that you're doing is quite critical to ensure that kind of conversions, and that they are sources that candidates are going to get the information that they need. Good to see careers fairs performing well here. It's been kind of obviously a challenging couple of years for both students and universities and employers to all connect, but it's good to see that that is working both on a virtual and where we have more face-to-face opportunities now coming back into play, that both careers events and university careers services are performing well in terms of numbers of applications. And then I guess a standout stat we wanted to call out really was the kind of, I guess, the performance that Bryant Network put in here through the work that they're doing in the market. So they're next with over 18,000 applications, converting in 6.34 hires, which when you compare to some of the other kind of job boards and media sources, such as if we look here at Milk Round and Target Jobs, for example, not giving us the application numbers or indeed actually the hiring ratios that we would expect from the budget that you're putting behind those kinds of activities. So some really interesting data here to help inform decision making with your budgets for the season that's kind of we're all now beginning to plan for. Then looking at how that works, what we've seen with apprenticeship sources of applications, really superb result here for school career services. They're way out in front of other sources with 27.5% of all hires from just 7.28% applications. So just 2,802 applications in total, but resulting in more than a quarter of hires. So that's a really great job that the schools career services are now doing. I think everybody is now very much focused in mainstream education on the opportunities that apprenticeships can bring, and that has been a real shift in terms of what we've been able to see in the past. So that's a very pleasing result. And then in line with what we've seen with graduate recruitment, both Google and company website are performing well in terms of application numbers and eventual percentage of hires. So again, important to invest in the content on your website and what you're doing from a search engine perspective. And then we see government job boards and so on then kind of performing. So nothing kind of too surprising there, just a really kind of positive story coming out from the schools. The other kind of just one call out I would just say is that indeed applications ahead of anybody else at just under 10,000, but actually they're only accounting for 5% of hires. So how targeted and how much return on investment are you actually getting from putting budget there, as opposed to potentially doing more with schools networks or putting it into your actual website itself. And then finally, looking at university weighted ranking, there's some kind of unsurprising kind of information coming through, that we see the Russell groups kind of performing well. We've got Warwick sitting at the top. And then sort of some of the kind of non-Russell groups slipping a little bit. And there's some domination from the Russell group again, and then a bit of slippage from non-Russell group universities, which is disappointing to see. The biggest year-on-year jumps in terms of weighted ranking are Manchester, King's College London and Queen Mary's London, and Nottingham, Bath, Loughborough, York and Southampton have all had significant droppage this year in terms of performance when it comes to actual conversion to hires. I guess the key takeaway from this particular slide is the trend that we're seeing here, the disappearance of many of the EU universities from the top 30, particularly Polish universities, and the increase actually in the number of non-EU universities, particularly those in South Africa and Australia, which we're putting down to the Brexit effect. While the application volumes from those non-EU universities are relatively low in comparison to other sources, the conversion ratios are actually quite exceptional. So we're kind of doing a bit more of a data dive into that, but I think it's worth, if you're able to sponsor overseas students, it might well be worth considering that these universities are clearly supplying some quality candidates. It could be an area that could be worth exploring for your graduate recruitment in the new season ahead. So overall, just some reflections and some takeaways from attraction here. Really thinking about we are in a situation where it's a very much candidate-led environment at the moment. So what more can you be doing with your attraction budget? Where are you spending it and who with? And what are you doing from an engagement and content perspective too, ensuring that what you're saying and what you're putting out there is truly impacting on the audience and resonating. We're seeing an increased usage of tools such as MatchMe at the outset, kind of during that attraction process, where candidates can really become a bit immersed in what an organisation might be able to offer to them, to kind of get a very early sense of buy-in, to then continue that and through the different types of content that are then served up, whether it be through attraction or through assessment or candidate management. So careful analysis on what you're doing with your budget, thinking about potentially some new things to engage and attract. And now is definitely the time to reflect on those stats that you're getting out from your end of campaign reviews and beginning to plan in the future. We're seeing that the market doesn't stand still at all, so be ready to change and be fluid with your budget. Don't spend it all and allocate it at the beginning of the season, because it may well be that you need to do some more or something different. So keeping on top of the attraction activity, how those channels are performing for you in real time, and stopping and doing something different if necessary. So really being agile around your media activity to ensure ultimately you're filling your demand and getting that return on investment from the providers that you're working with. I can see there's been some questions popping up. I think we'll kind of go back and have a look at those shortly. I think a couple have been answered in real time, so thank you for that, those that are answering. Okay, then moving on to the second biggest challenge for employers in the current market, and diversity inclusion is stands out. And then we look at how that's broken down. What are the kind of key areas of focus for diversity inclusion for employers? Gender is kind of the first key area focused, followed by ethnicity, and then social mobility. So what we've done is pull out some of the key data from the findings around those specific topics, but we have more if anybody wants to kind of drill down. This is just kind of top level view, and this data set is actually quite fresh as well. So there's a little bit of sort of mining that we want to do into some of the findings that we've got to kind of understand a little bit more about that. But we'll take you through where we are, starting with gender trends. So overall, from a graduate perspective, this is a good result. We're seeing that female candidates are statistically about 43% more likely to secure a role than males. We've got a conversion ratio here of 3.61% versus males at 2.52%. So we're seeing kind of less applications coming through, not significant, but actually then it's resulting in more hires. So females are performing well, that we've made some pretty good strides in this area across the board. And I think actually from an early careers perspective, this is super news, but actually when you kind of get further down the line in somebody's career path, and when we begin to look at equality at a more senior level, this shift in conversions and hires at the early careers stage will actually eventually positively impact on what we're seeing further up the line as people evolve and go through their careers. So this is good news, and we were really pleased to see this coming out in this season. Apprentices, slightly different, but actually still significant gains on previous years of data. So we're seeing more female applications than ever before. We are still seeing more male applications than females, but actually from a conversion ratio perspective, the girls are catching up, and we're seeing 5.99% female conversion ratios versus the males 3.15%. So some good news coming out from male female. And we're seeing that actually when we then delve into the data a little bit more, the overall rejection and withdrawal rates for males and females throughout a process are staggeringly similar, suggesting that the industry has really actually cracked the gender issue from online test right through to final assessment. So some really pleasing stuff coming out there. Then looking at disability statistics. So again, from a graduate perspective, it's a really good news story that we're seeing here. We've got conversion ratios, when you look obviously at the application numbers and those declaring their disability versus those not having a disability. When we then look at how they perform through a recruitment process, and what we actually see in terms of eventual hires is 3.66% conversion ratio for disability versus a 2.96 for those without. When we kind of then think a little bit more about those that are preferring not to state, it's that kind of continued question of why are they preferring not to say? Is it because they feel that there could be then an adverse impact on their application? Is it something that they're nervous of declaring in case they don't then get through a process? Or is it that they just don't recognise themselves or don't want to declare their disability? But from some of the sort of youth panels that we've been running recently, both from a graduate and an apprenticeship perspective, there are those candidates that feel quite comfortable declaring their disability at an early stage of a process, but then getting nervous later down the line when it comes to the face-to-face aspect of a process. That's when they begin to feel nervous about their disability and how they might well perform when they're face-to-face with somebody. So thinking always about your process, thinking about the language that you're using, the content that you're putting out there to ensure that candidates feel super comfortable declaring the disability that they have, and that actually every possible effort will be made to ensure that it's a really fair, balanced and inclusive process. Apprenticeships are less concerned with stating their disability at the outset of a process, but those are the ones that actually do worry more at final stage interview, interestingly. We're seeing a slight change in the data from an apprenticeship perspective in terms of those candidates that are successful at hiring stage, slightly in favour of those without a disability, but still, again, it is a good news story, and we have seen some positive shift, just a little bit of divergence from what we're seeing from an apprenticeship perspective. For graduate perspective, sorry. Then looking at the next trend is social mobility, and a hugely positive story here, actually, from actually quite surprising when we got the data out. So those that with one social mobility flag or more are actually more likely to get a job than those without, which is a really good indication that things are changing, that organisations are looking much more broadly at the candidate pool that they're attracting in terms of not just their messaging, but then those that they're bidding through, and the restrictions being lifted, if you like, in terms of who more traditionally might have looked to recruit. Social mobility candidates are performing better than their non-social mobility counterparts, with almost 50% better conversion ratio, 3.3% versus the 2%. We are actually offline looking in more detail at this particular set of data, because we were quite surprised at the kind of significant difference in terms of social mobility versus non-social mobility, because it's telling us that social mobility candidates are 135% more likely than non-social mobility candidates to be hired, which is really great news. But we want to then go and look at those flags and see what that truly is telling us. So more to come on that. And then finally, ethnicity, which still is actually a bit of a disappointing section, unfortunately. Looking first at graduates, where we have some more disappointing data than we might see in apprenticeships. What the data is telling us is that things still aren't fair and equal, and we need to kind of think about why that might be. Just under 14% of white British applicants are rejected at application stage, compared with around 22% for Arab, Black and Chinese candidates. And respectively, those candidates are then 61%, 59% and 57% more likely to be rejected at screening than white British candidates. One of the things that we've kind of looked at when kind of analysing this data, because it does appear that Black candidates overall are faring the worst, again, throughout the whole recruitment process, right through to hiring. We've just got kind of a conversion rate of just 1.62% here. I think the way we've looked at data in the past is quite different. We've kind of masked the issues, so it's been couched in BAME before, and now it's being separated out. So it is telling us a very specific piece of information here, that Black candidates are the most likely to not to be successful in a process. These stats for graduates do actually contrast quite significantly, though, with apprenticeship stats. We don't really know why. We kind of, is there a higher percentage of white students overall within graduate sector? Is teaching and support structures at uni more geared towards white students? We just don't know. Process bias, unconscious bias, all those different things. But actually, we are seeing some better news from the headline stats in apprenticeship programs that are recruiting candidates from much more diverse backgrounds, much more successfully than graduate programs. Asian candidates represent more than a quarter of all applicants and actually account for 30% of hires, which is pretty significant conversion, and Black candidates making up 11% of the applicant pool and then converting to 12% of hires. So some really, really good stats coming out here. Then, so just, I guess, reflections on what we're seeing. There are still clearly some challenges for minority groups, and a complete review of your assessment process will definitely help to identify and then support with any issues that you might be seeing. And kind of as previously stated, it is really important to separate out BAME so you get a really realistic and detailed view of what your statistics are looking like from a diversity perspective. Ensure that anything you're putting out to market, and then how you're dealing and speaking to candidates, either through your own teams or through your supplier teams, that messaging is there to ensure that candidates feel fully supported throughout a process, no matter what their background. And just again, that final reminder, employers and suppliers, we all really need to focus on Black heritage candidates as a target group, because that appears to be a very much a challenge across the board for everybody in this space. Yes, depressing stats indeed, Doreen. Thank you for that. We agree. Thanks. So handing over to Martin, who's going to talk now about some of the findings from an assessment and candidate experience perspective.
Thank you very much, Cassie. Yes, I'll be looking through the lens of assessment and candidate experience. So always a good place to start is keeping in mind the number of candidates who are given bad news for a process. So you can see there a very small percentage of that, over 300,000 candidates will be given good news at the end of the process. The other thing to keep in mind is how many are getting that sort of high touch interaction from your organization that typically comes from an interview and assessment center, and how many are getting interaction earlier, lighter touch stage, where perhaps they're just seeing your application form or your online assessment. And again, you can see here on the statistics, a very large percentage of the 300,000 plus candidates will be only interacting with the application and online assessment stage. It's over half of the candidates. So really key to get that stage of the process right. So in terms of what the typical process candidates are experiencing is, We haven't seen much change between 2021 and 21-22. The process is still broadly running at the same, a typical process that came back from the data. So some sort of application form, perhaps CV, but almost always now application form, then on to that online assessment stage, some sort of situational judgment tests. So candidates presented with scenarios they'll face in the role and ask how they will respond. And also some sort of cognitive ability assessment, still quite often used in processes. They then move through to some sort of more, as I'd call it, sort of human scored element of the assessments, is someone reviewing video interview more commonly now, but also telephone interviews happen at this stage. And then finally into the assessment centre stage. So as I say, whilst the broad process has stayed the same, you'll see there's been a big improvement in terms of the average time to offer, from an average of 88 days down to an average of 67 days. I'll just park that for us. I think there's a very specific reason for that in the data set we're looking at, which I'll come on to a little bit later. But that's a good news story in terms of time to hire. If we then move into how people are actually tracking the candidate experience, I thought this was a really interesting statistic. So given that a huge number of people are being sifted out before there's any face-to-face interaction, a very large percentage of the employer respondents were actually saying they don't measure the candidate experience. Now, I'm sure we've all seen the statistics around the commercial impact of people applying for a process and having a bad experience in that process. So I was quite surprised how many organizations are in effect blind to what the candidates will be saying about their interaction with them. And we took this a little bit further and asked whether respondents measure NPS. Now, NPS stands for Net Promoter Score. That's a standardized measure of candidate experience, which is really helpful, and we run a standard for our campaigns because it means you get a benchmark score which can be compared across the industry to look at what's happening at each stage. So if there is something going on in that online assessment which is problematic and candidates are struggling with, through the Net Promoter Score, you will get insight into that and be able to do something about that. In terms of the time to hire, just I suppose a bit of a reassurance that around the mean, it doesn't drastically change per sector. There's a bit of a peak in terms of technology and IT, but other than that, a fairly even spread around that mean. And then if we look at the percentage of offers accepted, again, we were seeing an average across all sectors of 87%. And again, perhaps just as reassurance, not a huge amount of variance across the different sectors. One of the things we've been talking about is renege rate. That someone asked what that meant. I'm glad it wasn't just me that needed that defined. So that would be if a candidate has accepted an offer, and between accepting that offer and joining the organisation, they've retracted that acceptance. So very interesting data. And as Emily said, we've split out any bits where there are really clear differences in our types of, in the sectors we looked at. So if we look at the graduate renege rates, really high. So there's about 15% of the employers responding who have got a 20% or higher renege rate, which is, I found that a really surprising statistic and really significant. And I suppose particularly as we're seeing that real benefit in terms of time to hire and the speed of process, that time between accepting, and in line with data that Cassie was showing, that time between accepting the offer and joining the organisation can be really long. So a really good takeaway here is particularly for that graduate group, thinking about what you're doing to keep them warm, keeping them engaged, building on all the good work you've done through your attraction and assessment. So a very different picture in the apprentice scheme. So perhaps less feeling of choice or options in that group could be a reason for this, but we're not seeing anyone with 20% or above renege rates. And the majority of organizations are having renege rates of under 5%. So a very different picture there. In terms of how that looks by sector, there is a little bit of a variance here. So lowest renege rates in professional services and finance, quite a spike there in retail. So anyone recruiting into these sort of these types of roles in the retail sector, definitely something there to think about, in particular around the keep warm process and what can be done about reneges. So the final thing to share is cost per hire. So obviously a notoriously tricky statistic to get. I know from discussions that different organizations look at cost per hire in different ways. So some people will just think about the attraction budget. Some people will look at the end-to-end process. We asked the question as best we could to get accurate data, and it's still obviously interesting to see how those rates differ across the sectors. So by far the highest cost per hire, which is well above the average in the technology and IT sector, which is just under £8,000, which is sort of more around double the average cost per hire across all other sectors. So we've ended each section with a and what I wanted to talk about and encourage you to think of the data we've shared through the lens of assessing for potential. Now, we also went out in partnership with ISE with a poll looking at how organizations are assessing their graduates and apprentices. And we asked whether organizations were recruiting for potential. And we found that 83% said they were. Of the 13% who weren't, 93% of those say they are currently considering recruiting for potential. So this is either lots of organizations doing it or wanting to move in that direction. But what was really interesting is the finding that actually less than half were confident they knew how to measure potential in candidates, and only 19% were very confident. So lots of organizations recruiting for potential without perhaps the confidence in how they would do that. So I just wanted to talk about the fact that the 300,000 plus candidates are likely to be going through, and over time more will be going through sort of online assessments designed by the Amberjack team. So as Emily said, I'm new to the assessment team at Amberjack. I was really attracted by this vision, which is enabling a world in which individuals are hired and progress solely based on their future potential rather than past experience or privilege. So we keep that in mind when we design our processes. And particularly, I've spoken a couple of times about that online assessment stage. And one of the things we really focus on is a blended assessment. Now, Cassie mentioned that she was quite surprised by the social mobility data, that it is possible that because of focused assessing for potential rather than experience or privilege, that's why we're seeing the uptick in the better conversion rates in those social mobility flagged candidates. So just to talk about why this happens, I spoke earlier about the use of particularly cognitive ability assessments. Often they're used as what we call a single criterion assessment. So candidates are put through a cognitive ability test and a certain number are progressed through. That has quite big problems in terms of particularly some diversity statistics and also that social mobility area. So all of our assessments are designed from first principles to be blended. So candidates complete a range of data, provide a range of data in one go, and then that overall score is mapped to our model of potential identification. So that is important when interpreting our data, because that could also be behind that really positive statistic around the time to hire. So they're completing a range of assessments in one go, you're getting the data you need, you're able to make decisions quicker on who to progress through to the next stages. And in terms of the benefits that approach brings, you would expect it to result in stronger candidates at the later stages of the assessment process. So again, Cassie was sharing earlier the conversion rate, which is meaning less candidates per hire. So that's probably because stronger candidates are coming through the process, and there's perhaps, as we're seeing with our clients, less need to go out for a sort of almost a second campaign to mop up the candidates that you weren't able to get, which will result in a better candidate to hire ratio and improved time to hire on average. It has a positive impact on the candidate experience. They don't need to jump into a number of different processes. There is obviously that impact around they're accepted sooner, so you've got longer to manage that keep warm process. Big efficiencies in terms of the candidate and recruiter time that we've seen throughout the presentation, and it would also lower cost per hire because of those efficiencies. The way that it works as well, because you're getting various sources of data and you're getting a more holistic picture of the individual rather than looking at individual criteria, you would expect it to ensure a healthy pipeline of diverse candidates is retained throughout. Cassie raised some points at the end of the equality and diversity section. We monitor all of our assessments for both Net Promoter Score, as I mentioned, but also really importantly, how it's performing in terms of the equality and diversity statistics. So lots to look at in more detail as we think about the end-to-end. So that's the data we wanted to share and a bit of the context and thinking about what you might want to do. So before we go on to what to expect next, I'll hand over to Stephen to let us know if any questions have come through.
Fantastic, great. There was loads of really deep insights there, and stuff that I was quite caught by surprise actually on one or two things. So we've had so if you've got any questions, do pop them into the Q&A. I've got it open on my other screen, which is why I'm looking sideways, so I'm keeping an eye on those. One question that came through for yourself, Cassie, is how are you defining a social mobility candidate? You're on mute, Cassie.
Oh, you've gone back on mute.
Is that working now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know why that didn't work. Apologies. So we have various social mobility flags. And the more flags a candidate has, so they include state school, first generation going to university, school meals, and then carer status, refugee status. So there are a number of different flags that candidates can allocate to their own personal status, which then gives us a sense of what their situation is and how well they're then performing in comparison to candidates that don't have those flags, that potentially are grammar schools versus state schools that are underperforming. It's lots of different things that kind of count towards that particular status and how we measure that candidate. And that is one of the reasons why we want to do a bit more of a deeper dive into the data that came out from this particular study, because it's a really interesting area. Emily, Marta, don't you add anything to that? Anything else you'd?
Yeah, I just said, but for the purpose of the research, how we defined a social mobility candidate is if they had one social mobility flag. Cassie ran through those flags, and I think it was definitely evident to us that there are probably some flags that indicate more of a sort of a lean to a lower socioeconomic background than others. So, for example, children going to state school, or even first generation to university versus free school meals. So what we're going to be doing with that data is having a look at each of those flags and seeing if that impacts the data in any way. But hopefully that gives you a more sense of how we've defined them.
Great, thanks. A question I also had, Cassie, and because it's something that I put a little bit in the chat about the data on female applicants, because we last looked at this a few years ago, and it very much backed up what we found then, which was that basically, if I summarize, women are more successful at getting through the selection process, but they're less likely to apply, because actually, the last time I looked at the HESA stats, it's not really a 50-50 market. I think there's something like nearly 60% of all students are female. So in a sense, it should be the other way. I mean, any thoughts on that? Is it I mean, I've heard people say it's very difficult as a bloke to comment on it, really, but I've heard some people say it might be a confidence issue. Some of those kind of thoughts around,
Definitely confidence issues. So that there's insight that females think about what they can't do, what box they don't tick, whereas what they potentially could do, which is why the potential model is so inclusive and fair, because I think the guys have a more kind of, this is very generalist, but it's that bombastic, I can do that, I could give that a go, and they'll just go for it and apply. Whereas females definitely consider more about, could I do it? I haven't done it before, or that, you know, so it's that more considered approach. And they are statistically less likely to apply for lots of things. They'll select 2 or 3 focused options for who they want to potentially go and work for, rather than kind of spreading their application love across a number of different employers. So it's a kind of a more considered approach to their application process. Obviously there's differences, some females will go for it and some guys might be more careful, but generally speaking, that is
it's hard to generalize, but I mean, that data, like I said, I think we last did it about 4 years ago, so that's definite trend data. It's not that it's a one-off, so it's something that definitely worth getting under the skin of us. So basically, as blokes just tend to blag it more.
Well, I wouldn't want to say, Martin.
I was just going to add into that. I mentioned when I was looking through the typical flow of the assessment process that probably 5 to 10 years ago, that application form may well have said CV is the most typical thing done up front. So there's been a really good positive shift away from CVs, which obviously have a big leaning towards experience, and the data shows they're not very predictive at all, towards application forms. But we're still having lots of conversations with our clients, exactly to Cassie's point of, is that absolutely required in the application form? Is that really, really needed? And really encouraging to think about the sort of questions that are or really, really needed for the role and really, really predictive of success? Or are they things that someone said it would be nice to have that has ended up in an application form and could be putting off female candidates for the reason that Cassie has said?
Definitely, thanks. Another question here from Lee, and it was talking about the survey on companies providing feedback to unsuccessful candidates. And I know this can be a slightly contentious issue, because particularly the volume of numbers that we're talking about. If you, and some of you know, I used to work for EY years ago, and I was chatting to the guys there quite recently, and they get double the number of applications they used to get when I was there 9-10 years ago, and they were eye-watering numbers then. So anyway, that aside, the question is around usefulness of feedback, and actually any indication of how much candidates are getting feedback that actually is useful to them, rather than something that's like, where you were on a percentage scale in terms of success rates.
Yeah, I'll check with Emily about whether there was any specific questions about who's providing feedback explicitly. But again, the 300,000 will be a lot of candidates completing our processes. So by standard, we provide feedback for particularly the online assessment, for the reasons I was talking about earlier. There's an automated report which is returned to the candidate. And it has a huge impact, positive impact on Net Promoter Score if you do provide that candidate feedback to individuals. So certainly I've seen campaigns where there isn't feedback provided, there is a negative impact on that Net Promoter Score. But Emily, I'm not sure if we specifically asked about who was providing feedback.
No, we haven't got that specifically, unfortunately, but it's definitely something that we could, as a follow-up, do some more digging into. And I guess it's that the question is actually how that automated process, how much value that is adding. And I think from what you're saying, Martin, is that the automated feedback is still improving that candidate experience, but it's making sure that that is as personalized as it can be, rather than just as Stephen was saying, like a rated score. So don't have it specifically, but could certainly do some more digging into it for sure.
Fantastic, thanks. Another question here. So Lee says thanks for the feedback. Swapped in the chat. A question here from Kieran. The data on the legal sector acceptance and renege rates was not available. Was there a specific reason for that?
There was, and that was because actually for that particular question, the legal sector didn't really want to give us any feedback. So we didn't actually have enough responses to be able to report on it. Sorry, we should have flagged that. So it wasn't that they're not getting any reneges, it was more that we didn't have enough valid data to be able to report on it.
Fab, thanks. And one last question from me, actually, just to hand back to you, Martin, for next steps, as you said, which is, and I'm a bit reluctant to ask this because it might be on a slightly gloomy note, but I mean, it's great to see that spend going up on the sector. We all know that everybody's busy, application rates, filling vacancies at record highs. The FT this morning had a story on business confidence, though, saying that actually there's nervousness around the and I myself am thinking, you know, next autumn, the next year, I think long run, actually the need to grow and retain talent is there. So I think our sector is going to become ever more important, not just because of Brexit and other reasons. But I was just wondering if you're starting to see signs yet that maybe over the next 6 to 12 months we might be in for a slightly rocky period, or is it a bit too early to tell yet?
I think, I mean, from a kind of my role, which is, you know, from a client delivery perspective, it feels very buoyant still. So organisations are investing ahead of new season in their assessment process. There's a lot of work going on from a kind of redesign. There's sort of people have stood still for a while, apart from potentially embracing newer technologies. There's a lot of investment that we're seeing going into processes, investment into kind of websites and attraction. So it feels there's a lot of confidence. You know, we work with quite a large number of, you know, as you know, Stephen, of both graduates and apprenticeship employers, and there truly isn't one organisation that is doing less or looking to do less in the next season than they're currently doing. There's, you know, kind of numbers shift in different streams, but overall it feels that there's growth in that sector and that there's confidence in the you know, in the surety of bringing, you know, future talent into organisations. How that then plays out, you know, on a kind of broader level from an experience type perspective, it again feels very buoyant. I mean, we do a bit of work in that area, but equally, you know, we're like everybody else, seeing the kind of the challenges of the kind of workplace. People haven't changed jobs for a couple of years, so now there's a lot of activity. People are being poached left, right and centre all over the place. So it feels, from a broader recruitment perspective, it's very buoyant at the moment, and confidence is there in terms of creating new roles or adding to people's teams. I don't know if you guys would agree, Emily, Martin, but it feels good. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't work, you know, with clients directly, but, you know, I guess the gloominess hasn't filtered down just yet. We're still in a place where yeah, lots of activity and lots of positivity.
And we do get quite a lot of insights, you know, from the kind of investment market and things. You know, we've got, you know, and yes, there is kind of clearly some economic downturn and some challenges, but actually from a human capital perspective, everything feels relatively still buoyant.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, the long-term data is that actually, yes, early talent and that need to grow is definitely strong. So actually, I think that's why our industry tends to weather recessions pretty well now. I am slightly conscious of time, and Martin, you were going to just go back to next steps. There's one question that just popped in. Well, one comment from Amanda saying she'd be really interested to know more about blended assessment, so we'll be able to follow up after that. Doreen's asked a question: what can career services do to enable students to prepare for recruitment processes that assess for potential? So I wondered if you wanted to answer that, Martin, and then just give us a little bit on next steps to close.
That's a really good question, something that actually I gives me a good opportunity to sort of talk about. It's not just career services, but employers. There's a really important point on the sort of inclusivity area about providing, if possible, practice assessments. So I would say it's sort of almost incumbent on employers and suppliers to make available practice assessments. And again, that's something we do as standard. It's really important because people want to make sure they're putting their right foot forward, able to demonstrate what they can bring to the role. And also, really importantly, from an inclusivity point of view, people can try out an assessment, make sure that they're able fairly to complete it. So I think there's making sure that those practice assessments, when candidates are going through a particular process, are available and career services are able to get access to them is a really key point in that. And that's another thing that has a big impact on performance in terms of DE&I as well.
Great, thanks, Martin. So Martin, were you just going to do a last bits on next steps? Was that the plan, just to
I'll hand over to Emily for that, but yes.
Oh, Emily, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning, today was really just to do the high level data and themes. We've only had a couple of weeks to analyse the data. So what you'll see over the coming weeks is some more detailed reports for each of the themes that we've covered today. We will distribute those through the ISE as well, so you'll be able to access them. But we will also be doing some more deeper dives sessions throughout July, so watch out for those. We are offering the opportunity for anybody who is interested to do more of a bespoke session for wider early careers teams. So please do get in contact if you're interested, and also around that individual data point. If there's something you've seen today that you think would be really helpful for you internally, to support business case or even looking at new season, then please do get in touch. We have a data analyst who can look into the data in more detail for specific areas. So if you do want any of that, then do let us know. Our email addresses are here. You can obviously find us on our website as well. But thank you so much for joining today. Really hope that's been an interesting hour, and we provided you with some insights that you that are helpful and you can use into new season. And we look forward to hopefully seeing some of you at the conference next week. But otherwise, at future sessions. So thanks for joining, and thanks for Stephen for hosting.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. That was a great, really informative session. There's some really powerful data points there. And as always, please do follow up with Emily, Cassie, or Martin on the email addresses there. Also, the recording will be available shortly, so you will be able to go back and recap and also share any of the stuff that we've covered. So, and yes, as you said, Emily, anybody that's coming to Brighton next week, we look forward to seeing you there. We've got over 400 people coming now. We've got through the whole event, so really strong bookings, which is great to see. Our first time back together in person over a couple of years, where we'll be exploring themes like this and many more, I'm sure. So if we can see you next week, hopefully we will. But Emily, Cassie, Martin, thanks. That was a really great, very useful session. See you all soon. Bye for now.
Thank you,
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Bye.